Good morning, philosophers. I hope you all had a fantastic fall break and that you're well rested and ready for more philosophical adventures. In the first half of this course, we devoted ourselves to normative ethics, the study of what makes an action morally right or wrong, praise or blameworthy, and why. We are now moving on to a new set of topics that belong to a different branch of moral philosophy, namely metaethics. Metaethics studies the philosophical presuppositions of moral thought and practice, especially from the point of view of metaphysics, epistemology, and the philosophy of language. One of the most important and most venerable questions in this area concerns the conditions under which people can be held morally responsible for their actions. This is the question that will preoccupy us for the next 2 lectures. It's the most natural thing in the world to want to hold people accountable for their behavior. If someone has acted in a way that is morally admirable, we think that it is fitting to praise them for their action. When someone has, without excuse, acted in a way that is clearly morally wrong, we think they are the appropriate target of blame and resentment, and perhaps, more than that, of punishment. But in fact, philosophers have long feared that our ordinary practices of holding ourselves and others morally responsible for our behavior rest on feet of clay. The most common worry is the topic of today's lecture, namely that there is a deep tension between the thought that people are morally responsible for their actions and a metaphysical thesis about how the world works at the deepest level. This is the thesis of determinism. If you had asked a scientifically literate person from the age of Newton until roughly the 1920s or 30s about their view on how the world works at the most fundamental level, the majority would have given you something like the following reply. The world is governed by deterministic laws of nature. What happens in the world is the product of the initial starting conditions of the world in conjunction with these laws of nature. To be sure, we don't currently know what all the laws of nature are, and we certainly don't have complete knowledge of the state of the world at any given point. But in principle, everything that happens in nature is subject to and explainable in terms of these deterministic laws, they would have said. In other words, they would have been apt to embrace a thesis which Richard Taylor, in today's reading, calls the thesis of metaphysical determinism. Given exactly what went before, the world could now be none other than it is. According to the metaphysical determinist, the facts of the past, together with the laws of nature, determine every truth about the future. So, if determinism is true then, given the actual past and holding fixed the laws of nature, only one future is possible at any moment in time. The French mathematician and natural philosopher Pierre-Simon Laplace makes this picture of the world vivid in a thought experiment. Imagine, he says, a supremely intelligent and knowledgeable being, a so-called Laplacian demon. This demon knows all the laws of nature, has complete knowledge of the present state of the world, and has unlimited computational power. If determinism is true, it follows that this demon can come to know everything that will happen in the future. The demon can have such foreknowledge of the future because there is only one way the future can be, given the laws of nature and the present state of the world. And given his unlimited computational power, the demon can work it out. Okay, but while the thesis of metaphysical determinism was widely accepted among the scientifically literate as a thesis about the natural world, philosophers and lay people alike have, from the very beginning, been troubled by the implications that this thesis appears to have for human freedom, and in particular for moral responsibility. After all, we human beings are part of nature, and our actions are events in nature. Consequently, the thesis of metaphysical determinism, if true, applies to us and our actions, as Richard Taylor puts it, quote, "I am a part of the world. So is each of the cells and minute parts of which I am composed. The principle of determinism, then, in case it is true, applies to me and to each of those minute parts, no less than to the sand, wheat, winds, and waters." Now, the thought that human beings too are part of nature and thus governed by deterministic causal laws is not shocking so long as we consider only purely physiological changes of our bodies, such as growth and aging, our pulse, glandular secretions, and so on. But what of our thoughts and ideas? And what of our behavior, which we like to think is, at least on some occasions, deliberate, purposeful, and perhaps even morally praise or blameworthy? After all, these too are events in nature. And if these are all simply the causal consequences of the conditions under which they occur, and these conditions are in fact the only ones that could have obtained given the state of the world just before they arose, then are my actions really up to me? And can I really be morally responsible for what I do? As Taylor writes, "What now becomes of my responsibility for my behavior and of the control over my conduct that I fancy myself to possess? What am I but a helpless product of nature, destined by her to do whatever I do and to become whatever I become?" In short, the worrisome question is this: if the thesis of metaphysical determinism is true, then am I ever morally responsible for my behavior? Am I ever to be praised or blamed for my actions? Well, a simple argument suggests a negative answer. First premise: there is no moral blame nor merit in anyone who cannot help what he does. Second premise: if determinism is true, you cannot help what you do. Conclusion: therefore, if determinism is true, you are not to praise or blame for anything. Let's look a little closer at this argument. So, in support of the first premise, consider examples of compulsive behavior, such as the actions of kleptomaniacs, drug addicts, and so on. Now, in really severe cases, we think that these people simply cannot help what they do. And it's a mark of civilization that we don't hold them morally responsible for what they do from compulsion. The worry is that if the thesis of metaphysical determinism is true, then what we thought of as an exceptional, abnormal case actually turns out to be the rule. That's what premise 2 asserts. For consider, if determinism is true, every action has a cause. And given that cause, the action could not have been otherwise. So then, is it not true of every action I perform that I couldn't help but perform it, and therefore, by the principle in premise 1, I shouldn't be held morally responsible for it? The upshot of the simple argument would be this: if determinism is true, no one has moral responsibility for anything they do, in the sense of meriting praise or blame for their actions. That is a radical and disturbing thought. Now, let's be clear. The truth of metaphysical determinism would not pull the rug out from under all our moral assessments. For instance, even if determinism were true, it wouldn't follow that no actions are morally better or worse than any other actions, or that everything goes morally speaking. No, our actions could still be assessed as morally better or worse, for example, in virtue of doing what benefits or harms other people and other sentient creatures. What would follow from the truth of determinism, if this simple argument is sound, is that it would be inappropriate to blame a person for performing a morally bad action, or praise them for performing a morally good action. We could note that agents have done the right or wrong thing on a certain occasion, but it would be inappropriate to praise or blame them for it. For the thought goes, blame or praise are inappropriate where an agent couldn't have acted otherwise. Such a conclusion, as I've said, would be deeply disturbing. It runs counter to our self-conception as human agents and to our practices of praise and blame. It would also undermine the most natural justification for our practices of holding each other accountable for our behavior, including through punishment. For surely, it seems unjust to punish someone for acting wrongly if they couldn't help but act in this way. Now, for a very brief but thrilling literary treatment of the corrosive effects of coming to grips with causal determinism, I warmly recommend to you the sci-fi short story What's Expected of Us by Ted Chiang, which was the bonus reading for today. Do check it out. It's only 3 pages long. Okay, so this is where we stand. Taylor's simple argument posits that free will and moral responsibility are incompatible with the truth of determinism. So, if the thesis of metaphysical determinism is true, then we are not free in acting in a sense that would make us morally responsible for our behavior. To introduce a bit of jargon from the contemporary literature on free will, Taylor is a so-called incompatibilist about determinism and moral responsibility. For Taylor, the all-important question then is to work out if the thesis of metaphysical determinism is in fact true. As you know from the reading, Taylor's ultimate conclusion is that the thesis of metaphysical determinism ought to be rejected. In what follows, we will retrace Taylor's arguments against determinism and carefully unpack them. However, right at the end of today's lecture, we will revisit Taylor's simple argument, which purports to establish that determinism is incompatible with moral responsibility, and we'll give it a second critical look. Is it actually the case that the truth of determinism is incompatible with moral responsibility, as the simple argument asserts? Or can we perhaps find a way of resisting the simple argument after all? All right, but first things first, should we accept the thesis of determinism? Well, how does one approach such a vast question? Taylor has an answer. According to him, the question can, quote, like all good questions of philosophy, be answered only on the basis of certain data. That is, by seeing whether or not it squares with certain things that everyone knows or believes himself to know, or with things everyone is at least more sure about than the answer to the question at issue. He goes on. There are 2 things about myself of which I feel quite certain. The first is that I sometimes deliberate with the view to making a decision namely to do this thing or that. And the second is that whether or not I deliberate about what to do, it is sometimes up to me what I do. This might all be an illusion, of course, but so also might any philosophical theory, such as the theory of determinism, be false. The point remains that it is far more difficult for me to doubt that I sometimes deliberate and that it is sometimes up to me what to do than to doubt any philosophical theory whatever, including the theory of determinism. We must accordingly adjust our theories to our data and not try to adjust our data to our theories. End quote. In the remainder of his chapter, Taylor then goes on to argue that his 2 intuitive data are, in fact, incompatible with determinism. Now, in today's lecture, I'm going to focus exclusively on Taylor's discussion of his second intuitive datum, that it is sometimes up to me how I act, since that is where most of the interesting philosophy in his article happen. Taylor begins by clarifying the meaning of his second datum. To say that it is, in a given instance, up to me what I do, he writes on page 43, is to say that I am, in that instance, free with respect to what I then do. Okay, but this straight away brings another question in its train. What is it to be free with respect to what I do? For example, what must be the case for me to count as free in moving my arm, say? Well, there are two conditions which almost everyone can agree must be satisfied for me to count as free with respect to moving my arm. For one thing, there mustn't be any external obstacles or impediments to my action that render it impossible. I mustn't be in chains, for example, or boxed in or physically incapacitated. Second, there mustn't be something that forces or constrains me to perform this action. My arm, for example, is not being moved by an irresistible physical force. So suppose that, like a marionette, my arm was attached to a rope and a puppeteer pulled on the rope to make my arm rise. Now, my arm moves for sure, but clearly this does not count as me freely moving my arm, right? So the absence of external obstacles and of force or constraint are both necessary conditions on my action being free. The question now is, and this is going to be our first thinking exercise for today, are these two necessary conditions also jointly sufficient for my action being free? In other words, is satisfying these two conditions all it takes for my action to be free? Or if that's not enough, why not? Why don't you pause the video and take a few minutes to consider these questions for yourself? All right, welcome back. So the question we're considering is it enough for an action to be free that the agent is unimpeded and unforced in performing this action? Well, suppose the answer to this question were yes. That would open the door to a happy resolution to the free will problem. For if free activity just is unforced, unimpeded activity, then there is in fact no inconsistency between affirming determinism and the claim that I am sometimes free. For my actions can be free in the sense of being unforced and unimpeded, even though they are subject to deterministic laws of nature, which mean that I could not have acted otherwise. So-called soft determinists or compatibilists take exactly this line. They maintain that we can reconcile determinism with free action. More specifically, soft determinists or compatibilists typically affirm three claims. First, they claim determinism is true. Thus, all human behavior is caused and determined. Second, voluntary behavior is nonetheless free to the extent that it is not externally constrained or impeded. Thirdly, they claim that the causes of voluntary behavior are certain states, events, or conditions within the agent himself, namely his own acts of will or volitions, choices, decisions, desires, and so on. In other words, the soft determinist claims that if my action is unimpeded and unconstrained and arises from my own inner desires, choices, or volitions, then it is free. That is all it takes. Moreover, even if determinism is true, the soft determinist claims, there's a perfectly intelligible sense in which I could have acted otherwise. It is this. Had my inner states been different, so had I desired or chosen or willed to act otherwise, then I would have acted otherwise. So this soft determinist or compatibilist gambit holds out the hope that even if determinism is true, our actions could nonetheless be free and therefore the appropriate objects of moral praise or blame. Richard Taylor, however, is not buying it at all. To his mind, the soft determinist view of what it takes for an action to be free is much too undemanding. Surely, he argues, my action is only free if those inner states that determine what I do are themselves up to me. But if determinism is true, they are not up to me. For those inner states themselves have causes and could not have been otherwise given the initial conditions. To Taylor, it is cold comfort to state, as the compatibilist does, that if my choices or volitions had been otherwise, I would have acted otherwise. That is true enough. The point, however, is that they couldn't have been otherwise. Given the prior history of the world and the laws of nature, my choices or volitions could not, in fact, have been any different than they, in fact, were. So even if it is true that if my desires and volitions had been otherwise, I could have acted otherwise, the antecedent of this conditional is never fulfilled. Hence, he writes, we cannot avoid concluding that, given the causal conditions of those inner states, I could not have decided, willed, chosen, or desired other than I in fact did, for this is a logical consequence of the very definition of determinism. And this casts doubt on the idea that my actions are really free, if determinism is true. As Taylor puts it on page 50, determinism cannot be reconciled with our second datum, that it is sometimes up to me what I'm going to do. For if it is ever really up to me whether to do this thing or that, then, as we have seen, each alternative course of action must be such that I can do it. Not that I can do it in some abstruse or hypothetical sense of can, not that I could do it if only something were true that is not true, but in the sense that it is then and there within my power to do it. But this is never so if determinism is true. Whatever I do at any time is the only thing I can do, given the conditions that precede my doing it. End quote. Taylor drives home this point with a very nice thought experiment, which he thinks refutes the soft determinist's conception of freedom. Now, before we reconstruct his argument together, why don't you have a go at this yourself? Look at your text and ask yourself two questions. First, what is the thought experiment that Taylor presents to refute soft determinism? And secondly, why does Taylor think his thought experiment shows that soft determinism must be false? I'll wait for you. All right, welcome back. Let's give a name to Taylor's thought experiment. Let's call it the brain manipulation case. So, imagine a person, Taylor says, whose actions are entirely in accordance with her own volitions, but whose volitions are themselves being caused by an evil scientist who can induce these volitions in her at will by manipulating her brain using electromagnetic stimulation. Now, according to the soft determinist's conception of freedom, Taylor argues, the actions of the person in this brain manipulation case are free, since they are unimpeded and unconstrained, and are the product of the person's own volitions. But is that in fact the right thing to say here? Surely not. Surely this simply reveals the soft determinist's conception of free action to be wholly inadequate, Taylor thinks. The person in brain manipulation is not free, we think. She's a mere puppet. Now, if you agree with Taylor in this verdict, then we have a counterexample to the soft determinist's conception of free action. It is not enough to be free that one's action be unimpeded and unconstrained and arise from one's own inner desires, choices, or volitions. For if that were the case, then the action of the person in brain manipulation would be free. But patently, they are not free. Now, the soft determinist might try to respond as follows to Taylor's challenge. He might say, well, your thought experiment is crucially unlike our ordinary situation in acting. The patient in brain manipulation is being interfered with by another person, the evil scientist. Her desires, in fact, are being given to her by this evil scientist. But that isn't the case for most of us in our ordinary actions. So sure, if your volitions are the product of manipulation by another person, then perhaps your actions aren't free, even if they are unimpeded and unconstrained and in line with your own volitions. But this is of little significance for most ordinary instances of action, since in most ordinary instances of action, our volitions are not being manipulated by some evil scientist. Now, Taylor considers this rejoinder, but he thinks that it is unsuccessful. The fact is that if determinism is true, then we are still, in any instance where we act, in a situation that is relevantly like that of the person in brain manipulation. Our desires may not be given to us by another human agent, as in the thought experiment. Rather, they may be the product of hereditary or environmental factors. But surely this difference does not matter. As he writes on page 47, whether desire that causes my body to behave in a certain way is inflicted upon me by another person, or derived from hereditary factors, or indeed from anything at all, matters not the least. In any case, if it is in fact the cause of my bodily behavior, I cannot help but act in accordance with it. Wherever it came from, whether from personal or impersonal origins, it was entirely caused or determined, and not within my control. Indeed, if determinism is true, as the theory of soft determinism holds it to be, all those inner states that cause my body to behave in whatever ways it behaves must arise from circumstances that existed before I was born. For the chain of causes and effects is infinite, and none could have been the least different given those that preceded. End quote. All right, let's summarize what we've learned so far. So as we've seen, Taylor makes a case against the metaphysical thesis of determinism. Here's his argument summarized in a nutshell. 1. We should accept determinism only if it is compatible with the intuitive datum that how I act is sometimes up to me. 2. If it is ever really up to me how I act, then on those occasions I must be able to act otherwise. 3. But if determinism is true, it is never the case that I can act otherwise than I do. 4. Hence, determinism is incompatible with the intuitive datum that how I act is sometimes up to me. We get that from premises 2 and 3. Therefore, this is the conclusion of the argument, we should reject determinism. That follows from premises 1 and 4. So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that this argument is sound. Where would that leave us? If determinism is to be rejected because it conflicts with the intuitive datum that is sometimes up to me how I act, then what are the alternatives exactly? Well, Taylor considers one alternative, what he calls simple indeterminism. This is the thesis that, quote, insofar as they are free, my actions are not caused, or that if they are caused by my own inner states, my own desires, impulses, choices, volitions, and whatnot, then these, in any case, are not caused. But Taylor mentions the thesis of simple indeterminism only to immediately set it aside. It strikes him, in fact, as a complete non-starter. For simple indeterminism does not appear to help at all in making sense of the intuitive datum that it is sometimes up to me how I act. Think about it. If simple indeterminism is true, then my bodily movements, insofar as they are free, are uncaused, or the product of desires that are themselves uncaused. But then I have no control over them at all. They just happen from no causes at all. In a sense, we might say, the movements of my limbs are not even appropriately described as my own behavior, for behavior that is mine must, in some sense at least, be under my control. As Taylor writes, imagine an arm whose movements are uncaused. Manifestly, I have nothing to do with them at all. They just happen, and neither I nor anyone can tell what this arm will be doing next. It might seize a club and lay it on the head of the nearest bystander, no less to my astonishment than his. There will never be any point in asking why these motions occur, or in seeking any explanation of them. For under the conditions assumed, there is no explanation. This is no description of free, voluntary, or responsible behavior." End quote. So, if the intuitive datum that my actions are sometimes up to me persuaded us to give up on the thesis of metaphysical determinism, it should likewise prevent us from signing on to simple indeterminism. For simple indeterminism is just as hopeless at making sense of this intuitive datum as is determinism. Well, what a pretty pickle we find ourselves in. Things are looking pretty dire for the proponent of free will and moral responsibility, aren't they? In fact, one might be tempted to run the following knockdown argument against the very possibility of free will. It would go like this. First premise: if determinism is true, then we're not morally responsible for our actions because we can't help doing what we do. Second premise: if simple indeterminism is true, then we're not morally responsible for our actions either because our actions are like coin flips over which we have no control. Third premise: there are no further possibilities. Conclusion: therefore, we are not morally responsible for our actions. Now, as you know, Richard Taylor himself does not in fact endorse this argument. Before we talk about the final section of his chapter, why don't you take a moment and identify the premise in this argument that Taylor would reject? I'll wait for you. All right, welcome back. If your answer is premise 3, then bingo, you got it right. Give yourself a pat on the back. Taylor does not in fact believe that determinism and simple indeterminism exhaust the relevant possibilities. To make sense of the intuitive datum that how I act is sometimes up to me, Taylor thinks that we have to reject both determinism and indeterminism and instead endorse an entirely different way of thinking about human agency. According to this view, which is referred to in the literature as libertarianism, an action that is free is caused by the agent who performs it, not by some event within the agent, such as a desire or volition or brain state. And crucially, no antecedent conditions were sufficient for the agent performing just that action. It was up to the agent whether or not to act in this way or not. So, if this view is true, not all causal chains are infinite. Some causal chains begin with and are in fact initiated by agents. Moreover, agents initiate these causal chains under conditions that do not determine what action they shall perform. Now, as Taylor notes, this libertarian conception of human agency has quite a bit going for it. Most importantly, it fits what people take themselves to be, namely beings who decide their own behavior, who at least on many occasions have control over what they do and could have acted otherwise, instead of being beings whose behavior is simply the causal consequence of conditions that were not ultimately up to them. Indeed, Taylor thinks that if we're trying to accommodate the datum that how we act is at least sometimes up to us, then libertarianism seems really the only game in town. As he writes, if we are to suppose that it is sometimes up to me what I do, and understand this in a sense that is not consistent with determinism, we must suppose that I am an agent or being who initiates his own actions, sometimes under conditions that do not determine what action I shall perform. At the same time, however, a libertarian conception of free will strikes many as extravagant and quite ad hoc, because science really does seem to suggest that nature is governed by laws, some of which are deterministic, and others of which are indeterministic statistical laws, which we've seen doesn't help the case for free will either. Now, since we are part of nature, how can we assume that our own behavior is not governed by these laws as well? What makes us so special? There seems to be very little to motivate this thought other than that it is necessary in order to make sense of the idea that our actions are sometimes up to us. But isn't this just rationalization and philosophical special pleading? Taylor himself is painfully aware of these worries. As he writes in closing his chapter, one can hardly affirm such a theory of agency with complete comfort, and not wholly without embarrassment, for the conception of agents and their powers which is involved in it is strange indeed, if not positively mysterious. In fact, one can hardly be blamed here for simply denying our data outright, rather than embracing this theory, to which they do most certainly point. Our data rest on nothing more than fairly common consent. These data might simply be illusions. All right, so much for Richard Taylor's arguments in his chapter. But I promised to end this lecture on a more hopeful note, and that involves going back to an earlier point in the argument. Now, as you will recall, Taylor early on makes an argument for the thought that free will and moral responsibility are incompatible with the truth of determinism. Here it is again. So, first premise, there is no moral blame nor merit in anyone who cannot help what he does. Second premise, if determinism is true, you cannot help what you do. Therefore, if determinism is true, you are not to praise or blame for anything. Let's focus on the first premise of this argument. What does it mean to say exactly that someone cannot help what he does? Well, the way in which Taylor himself glosses this is that someone who cannot help what he does is someone who could not have acted otherwise than he did. This is what is known in the free will literature as the so-called principle of alternate possibilities. So let's substitute this into the argument. The argument would then read as follows. There is no moral blame nor merit in anyone who could not have acted otherwise than he did. If determinism is true, then no person could have acted otherwise than he did. Therefore, if determinism is true, no person is to praise or blame for anything. All right, having cleaned up the argument in this way, let's now ask, is this in fact as unimpeachable an argument as Taylor thinks? Or could we perhaps find fault with it somehow? In particular, should we accept its first premise, the principle of alternate possibilities? Is it really the case that I can only be morally responsible for an action in the sense of being eligible for praise or blame if I could have acted otherwise? In a brilliant and influential paper, Alternate Possibilities and Moral Responsibility, the philosopher Harry Frankfurt challenges this thought. He has us imagine the following scenario. Suppose that an evil neuroscientist by the name of Black wants Jones to perform a certain action. Let's imagine that the action in question is something morally bad, like assassinating some innocent politician. So suppose, Frankfurt writes, that Black is prepared to go to considerable lengths to get his way, but he prefers to avoid showing his hand unnecessarily. So he waits until Jones is about to make up his mind what to do. Should he shoot the politician or not? And he does nothing unless it is clear to him that Jones is going to decide to do something other than what he wants him to do. Right? If it does become clear that Jones is going to decide to do something else, Black would take effective steps, so by stepping in and manipulating Jones's brain, to ensure that Jones decides to do, and that he does do whatever Black wants him to do. Whatever Jones's initial preferences and inclinations, then, Black will have his way. However, as a matter of fact, let's imagine that in this specific case, Jones independently decides to shoot the politician and pulls the trigger. Black never, in fact, needs to intervene. What are we to make of this case? Well, here's the lesson that Harry Frankfurt wants you to draw. doesn't Jones seem responsible and blameworthy for shooting the politician? Because he decided to do so completely on his own. Black never intervened. But it seems that, given Black's presence, Jones couldn't have made a different choice, because Black wouldn't have let him. He would have interfered with Jones's brain had he been on the precipice of deciding otherwise. So to Frankfurt, the case of Black and Jones looks like a counterexample to the principle of alternate possibilities. It seems to show that being responsible for one's actions, and therefore being the appropriate subject of praise and blame, doesn't require the ability to do otherwise. I'll leave you with two questions to chew on. Has Frankfurt in fact succeeded in undermining the principle of alternate possibilities? And if yes, what should take its place? If it's not the ability to have acted otherwise, what exactly does it take for an agent to be morally responsible? These are among the questions that we'll turn to in our next lecture, when we'll read a second classic paper by Harry Frankfurt, Freedom of the Will and the Concept of a Person. Until then.